Hello, friends of the podcast, and welcome to Directionally Correct, a people intelligence podcast with your host, Cole Napper, and today's guest, Deniz, professor of industrial psychology at the University of Minnesota. In this episode, we will cover why the predictive value of cognitive ability tests may actually be declining.
We all agree that cognitive ability is an important predictor of job performance.
Whether conscientiousness is really all that matters, and what shrinking effect sizes across psychology research are actually telling us. Cognitive ability was the top predictor when used in conjunction with conscientiousness as a personality measure. And why Deniz is technically a self-taught IO psychologist herself. So you teach industrial psychology at University of Minnesota, but you actually have never taken a single IO psychology class before you entered the field. Like, how did that happen?
Absolutely true.
Now, let's get down to business. Hey, Directionally Correct fans. This podcast is dedicated to you to help democratize people intelligence for the world of work. If you're looking to support the podcast, please make sure to listen weekly, subscribe to the Directionally Correct Substack newsletter, sign up for the Data-Driven HR Academy at datadrivenhracademy.com, purchase Cole's book, People Analytics, or check out everything else at colenapper.com. Before we get into it, a quick word about HR Bench, the company powering this podcast. You know, when we all started in people analytics, we wanted to do strategic work, building predictive models, workforce planning, advising the C-suite, and most of all, quantifying the impact for the business. Instead, we spend months building dashboards and reports that should already exist. HR Bench eliminates that entire phase. Your HRIS connects, your metrics calculate, your benchmarks populate. This is not novel. This is day one, not quarter two. That means skipping straight to prescriptive analysis, storytelling, and taking action for the business. Want to learn more? Book a demo at hrbench.com/directionallycorrect. Find out more about the company powering this podcast and building the future of people intelligence. As always, all opinions are our own, and thanks for being a listener. Good to see you again.
Good seeing you too. I've been looking forward to this.
I gotta admit, I have too, but I'm also nervous.
Why?
Preparing for this episode, and by the way, we can just go ahead and get started if you're okay with it. Preparing for this episode was like preparing for one of those seminar classes back in graduate school. And I haven't done that in 15 years. So I'm a little rusty. And yeah, like maybe I'll give kind of the backstory here for people who might be listening. But probably almost 3 years ago now, back when Scott was still on the podcast, Scott and I had Paul Sackett on to talk about his bombshell paper that came out in 2022 about range restriction and how that kind of upended some of Schmidt and Hunter's work. And who would have thought that the little concept like range restriction would kind of, rock the whole world of IO psychology and some of the literature here. And that episode was one of our most popular of all time. I think on YouTube, it is the most popular thing that we've ever had. And so one of the things I try to do with the podcast is anytime there's something like controversial, I either A, just don't talk about it ever, or B, I want to talk about it on both sides. And this issue was one in which I didn't actually realize there was another side to it. And so I fast forward about a year after that episode came out, and I was at a conference and somebody came up to me and they were not upset about the episode, but we had a later guest that came on and kind of poo-pooed on some of the Schmidt and Hunter work. And they said, that I felt like that was like really inappropriate and that, that the other side of the issue of the Paul Sackett debate isn't really being covered. And I said, I didn't know there was another side of the issue. And so that person, thankfully, and this has been a long time coming, obviously, because that was like 2 years ago, we finally got to have you on the podcast. So Deniz, thanks so much for joining me. I know that's like a long intro, but I think it's important considering what we're talking about today. But my goodness, I've had to prepare so much for this episode just to do it.
So maybe I should interview you.
Well, I mean, no, please don't, because I'm going to do a very poor job of it. It's just I just think that it's really important when you're talking about something as high stakes as selection, that you come in and you don't kind of shoot from the hip. And so I thought it was really important that I do my research as well. But thank you so much for joining me today. But maybe we start with something a little bit more simple. And I thought this was so funny that you told me this. You mentioned that you teach industrial psychology at University of Minnesota, but you actually have never taken a single IO psychology class before you entered the field. Like how did that happen?
Absolutely true. My PhD is in business administration and human resource management. I
Hmm.
got it from University of Iowa, and I was lucky though to be taught by IO psychologists. So they were teaching in colleges of business, but they were IO psychologists. My mentor was Frank Schmidt. My dissertation committee had Jack Hunter on it, even though he was at Michigan State.
Hmm.
And I count also Mary Barrick and Mick Mount as mentoring figures. They were all on my dissertation committee. So yeah, I have not taken a single psychology class from a psychology department, though I am self-taught, through all of my readings through all of these years. And funnily enough, every single of my publications is in a journal that is billed as a IO psychology or a psychology journal. And I've seen actually myself over time through what I gravitate to, what I'm interested in, to become increasingly more and more an individual differences person rather than purely, oh, just people analytics or just selection, if you will.
Yeah. No, and I've actually seen that. So in preparation for this, prior guest and friend of the podcast, Fred Oswald sent me some articles to prepare for this, and then also one of your prior students and friend of the podcast, Kevin Stanek, sent me a whole bunch of things to look at. So I'm very grateful to them to help me prepare here. But I mean, the names that you just mentioned. So a lot of people who are IO psychologists listen to this, but a lot of non-IO psychologists and people all over the globe listen. The names you mentioned of Hunter and Schmidt and Mount and Barrick, this is like the Mount Rushmore of some of the biggest studies that have happened in IO psychology, and you were right in the thick of it. And frankly, I mean, I'm a little intimidated today because you and yourself are just such a prolific person in your own right. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I would be remiss if I also did not mention that, I've been at the University of Minnesota since 1996. So this is my 30th year at the University of Minnesota. And there, I learned a great deal from the late John Campbell, the multidimensionality of job performance. And with some of this research, I have actually watched it unfold in front of my very eyes. So I know the background stories, I know all the myths that eventually came, and so on and so forth. For people that may not realize this, Paul Sackett and I go back to the days that I was a graduate student. In 1991, I met Paul Sackett, and because I admired his research, I went up to him and introduced myself at a conference the way that he tells the story. I hunted him down at a conference with some of the findings that I had in my hand. And because I was showing him some very interesting results that I had gotten, he ended up graciously sitting down with me for 3 hours by an elevator and listened to what I had to say. And over time, I think I know I have benefited from being in the same department as Paul Sackett, and Paul being literally his office is next door to me.
Yeah. That's the funniest thing to me about this whole, thing. First of all, University of Minnesota, debatably, arguably the number one I was like PhD program out there. Like, and I don't actually think there's a lot of debate on it. Frankly, you guys are just littered with rock stars, and even your alumni are just so prolific in their own right. Um, but I just think it's so funny. Like I've got my own issues where like prior rivalries from graduate school are like shaping the whole field of people analytics, and I feel like you've kind of got that in your own respect with just people down the hallway. And so I think that's just so interesting. But maybe so I've given kind of my backstory on what led us to this point about the Paul Sackett revision, but can you give your version of the backstory, the down the hallway version of how this came to be, and what is the state of the state about effect sizes, cognitive ability, conscientiousness, adverse impact, all of the things that as Schmidt and Hunter, is it still relevant? Is it wrong? Is it right? I've got a bunch of articles I can cite. We can cite none of them if you want to. I don't care. I just want to make sure that you do it justice from your perspective.
I'm going to go back a little bit further back than just the 2022 and the reconsideration and the pieces that you referred to. I want to take us back because, few people probably have that are still active that have the true sort of knowledge of what happened and why and how. So I'm going to tell it the way that it all unfolded. The way that Frank Schmidt always portrayed it to us. I took personnel selection from Frank Schmidt. I took psychometrics from Frank Schmidt. And the way that he always told the story is that in 1960s and 70s, our field was mostly on the way to becoming purely a technology and nothing generalized, nothing. We had no major principles that united us around this works, this doesn't work, and every practitioner was kind of on their own. Here's something, try it out. It may work in your setting, it may not work in your setting, was sort of the best advice that we could give to practitioners. And when Frank started to work with Jack at Michigan State, they had the insight that in 1979 that differences that people were getting in different studies was because there is sampling error. So my by chance I have a certain sample size, it's probably small. Somebody else has a sample, and by chance, certain people are in it. So that chance element makes our estimates vary from situation to situation. Then they said, well, different people, different organizations, different measures, different settings, therefore reliabilities are likely to vary. So they nailed it down. There are reliability differences that may cause differences that we see. And then, of course, there's range restriction differences. I may have applicant pools which are tremendously restricted. Somebody else, someplace else, may have applicant pools that are unrestricted. And so that needs to be accounted for to account for variation from study to study. And that's how meta-analysis was invented. I'm very proud to be an IO. At least to be a pretend IO psychologist, or at least be in the field of IO psychology, because this method of meta-analysis, the formal methods, were laid down by Schmidt and Hunter. It was the term meta-analysis comes from Glass, who's not an IO psychologist, and the only reason why his publication in 1979, so is Frank and Jack's publication. The only reason is that Frank and Jack held on to their findings so that they could nominate themselves for an award, which they won. So our field has given a gift to the entire world in the form of meta-analysis, in the form of you never put your trust on any single study. This is a scientific enterprise, and it builds on top of each other, is sort of the message that comes from all of that. Now, fast forward, over many years, studies, including for cognitive ability, were published using the meta-analytic techniques. It's not a single number. The number that's represented in the 1998 paper that Schmidt and Hunter published comes from a particular set of studies, U.S. Employment Service studies. But there are many other meta-analyses that were published that are not in that matrix, in that list of in the table that they present. As a side note, that paper that Frank and Jack was published in 1998, I created the first of that table in 1993 when I was a PhD student. Frank and Jack updated that with additional information and wrote a whole article. But I actually created the first table that they started out with. And so it is important it's worthwhile to remember that it is from one single meta-analysis that represents a particular set of studies from US Employment Service. So fast forward 2022, when Paul and his colleagues, and several of them are PhD or former PhD students from University of Minnesota, and then my good colleague with whom I have published papers, and I've published papers with Paul as well, Philip Levens, they published that paper that called into question the range restriction values that were applied. So no, the thing that was not in question is what the observed average validity is. The question is whether we should correct for range restriction, and I give a lot of credit to Paul and his colleagues in that paper for drawing our attention to the importance of range restriction and how we ought to be careful about it. Okay. The piece that I disagree with is the point that all concurrent studies are unlikely to have major levels of range restriction. That's where this whole thing turns.
Mm-hmm.
And what does this mean? I mean, for you said all sorts of people listen to this podcast all around the world. If I'm going to look at the relationship between height and basketball playing performance, and all I have are NBA players in my group, I am not going to be able to demonstrate that height is correlated with better basketball performance. It's as simple as that, right? I mean, that's the simple observation. So the question is, who should we correct it back to, right? That's the question. Applicants, general population, and something in between? Should we study by study go back and match? All of this turns on that. And disagreements of direct range restriction, indirect range restriction, the appropriate group to correct to, is where a lot of us disagree with what has been done. And I'm a proponent of the thinking that you let the literature breathe. You let everybody have their say, and things will settle down, not on a single study, not two studies, maybe after 100 studies, 200 studies, 400 studies, then we can sit down and say, okay, this is where we have settled down at. If you look at my Big Five profile, you would find that my peak, my cardinal trait is openness, the intellect piece of openness, very, very high on that piece. And I'm open to experience. So what I have done is, rather than argue vociferously, I've written, yes, a commentary on Paul's paper. I also have a paper that was a commentary of something else that somebody else said. The message that is being taken from that paper that has spread like wildfire, that needs a lot of care, is, oh, cognitive ability is not important. That is not. We all agree, in even the people that are revising the number down, we all agree that cognitive ability is an important predictor of job performance. So the nuance that I like bringing to the picture is for whom, when, and where. And I'm happy to take each of those down for you.
Yes, please do.
Okay, so first, the for whom question. We can never trust validities that are uncorrected, that are in an employee sample, because those have been winnowed down. And we tend to think about, oh yeah, they've been winnowed down because there's a selection process, and that selection process may or may not have included cognitive ability. If it doesn't include cognitive ability and it's includes things that are correlated with cognitive ability. And many of our predictors have a heavy element of cognitive ability. And structured interview has a heavy element of cognitive ability in it. So you can go down the list of various predictors, and there's a heavy dose of cognitive ability in them. There are others, and we used to think that personality is completely uncorrelated with cognitive ability. The answer is no. I mean, my research with Kevin Stanek, that was published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, and then we also published a whole freely downloadable book about the topic, demonstrates that the two domains, cognitive ability and personality, are intertwined. Okay, so even when you use a personality inventory, depending on what you're measuring specifically, you might be actually, that's right, that's the book. You might be actually measuring partially cognitive ability. I'll give you some examples of traits that are correlated that might come as a surprise. For example, self-esteem, self-efficacy. If we measure those things, we're going to be measuring partially cognitive ability. So moving on. So
And
if
by
we
the
need
way,
to,
we've covered that PNAS article with you and Kevin on the podcast before too. Just so you know, you've gotten your flowers in that respect too.
thank you. That took a long time. That was a 14-year in the making study. So I'm actually quite proud of that work. Um, so, um, so for whom? So the companies that are looking for selection are looking at how will this work, or need to look at how does this work in my applicant pool. And the applicant pool, here's a key insight that came from a study that one of our former PhD students, Pierce Steele, I chaired his dissertation committee, published in Journal of Applied Psychology. Steele and Fariborzi, they nailed it down to applicant pools in the United States have become more narrow over time. So if you ask yourself, validity of cognitive ability, operational validity of cognitive ability needs to be looked at in applicant pools. How variable is my applicant pool is a key question. So if you want like an important thing for practitioners to take away is know your applicant pool and do not winnow it down until you use your most powerful predictor. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
so because whatever you use in place will winnow it down for you in a less effective way. So credentials, for example, instead of cognitive ability measures, that's a bad thing because credentials collapse people into buckets of credentialed versus not credentialed. You don't have the nuance of a continuous score on a credential, right? In a consulting project, I worked with an organization, this was over the last decade, where we actually got away from credentials and just looked at cognitive ability. So anybody could become anything and could get trained and get the credential through the company, right?
Yeah.
So for whom it needs to be applicant pools. But from a scientific perspective, if we're going to study the science of how does cognitive relate to performance in general, how does it relate to task performance, how does it relate to creativity, take your pick, whatever your criterion of interest is. And those questions are generic questions. They should not be customized in the scientific literature to what happens to be in somebody's applicant pool. I need to know, here is sort of the periodic table of our predictors and how well they work. Just like the periodic table has the elements and their masses and so on and so forth, we need to know, here is the property of this selection or this individual difference. This is what it will do. Now, how it works in your case versus in my case, may depend on who constitutes my applicant pool. That is a key question. So if that's my starting point, I should be able to go to the literature, look that number up, and before I use a selection inventory, I need to be able to then say, aha, because my applicant pool is much more restricted or not restricted at all, here's how it will work. That's the only way you can also take into account changing economic conditions, right? Think about I'll use an example from U.S. history. In 1920s, late 20s, when the Great Depression hit, people with degrees were applying to be manual laborers. They did not have a job. So applicant pools all of a sudden became very, very large, right? You could have your pick of anybody you wanted. So if we only had at that point in time operational validity of cognitive ability 0.30 only or 0.22 only, whatever number you want, some of these revisions are talking about as an operational validity. No, there are other things that we should be measured. Well, what could it be when the applicant pool is completely unrestricted? The entire population can apply. This is important because I'll go to my where part of my answer. I think we're being myopic by looking at only the US. US is not the world, has never been the world, right? There are different economic conditions around the world. There are different labor markets around the world. And to then dictate, and that's what happens when a US based estimate like this comes along, to dictate, oh, yeah, cognitive ability, not that important. There is not, the operational validity is now lower. Therefore, worldwide, move to something else or combine other predictors and so on. That is not a good message that we want to give to the world. We want the scientific number, the population number, so that it can then be customized of what it will be depending on what my labor market looks like, what your labor market looks like. So that's the for whom and where question. Now I'll move to the what question. The what question is, what is this valid for? Validity for what? Overall job performance, right? And overall job performance is fine and is actually probably the most important criterion, or has been the most important criterion in our field, but it's not the only criterion, right? Organizations may choose to take care of things like counterproductivity or citizenship behaviors using other levers that they may have than just selection, or they may have other things in their selection system that take care of those pieces of overall job performance. The piece that few other predictors take care of, as well as cognitive ability, is task performance or technical performance. If that is of concern, if that is a criterion to be maximized by the company, then absolutely. But that is a company-based choice. Some other company may say, no, tenure or preventing turnover is important for me. Well, then build your selection system for that. And that selection system is not going to have it as its major lever cognitive ability. So there are all of these considerations. So when I go into applied setting, I always try to carefully help my colleagues on the practitioner side work through for what, for whom, and where. Those are the three questions.
So let me do a quick PSA here for the people who aren't as familiar with what we're talking about. So the Schmidt and Hunter paper that we talked about found that if you're looking at the population, and that's really that kind of that baseline that you want to compare against for everyone that you were just mentioning, cognitive ability was the top predictor when used in conjunction with conscientiousness as a personality measure. And what Paul Sackett's work came along and said is actually cognitive ability still matters, like you mentioned. It just falls down the rankings of level of importance, and one variable of structured interviews actually moves up quite considerably in relation to all of this. Now, one thing from I went back and I re-listened to that podcast, and I remember Scott and I talking about it afterwards. And one thing that didn't make sense to me about that discussion is we mentioned that this argument has come along that said, well, actually, a lot of the studies that Schmidt and Hunter use, they're like 60, 70, 80 years old. They don't represent work as it's currently constituted now, because cognitive ability probably mattered more back then and less so now. That didn't make any sense to me because of the rise of things like knowledge work, and that work is actually not becoming less complicated and less cognitively loaded. It seems like it would be becoming more cognitively loaded over time, at least specifically for knowledge worker type of jobs. And so that argument didn't make sense to me. And I wanted to know if you had any data or reflections or research on that concept in and of itself.
Work itself around the world is becoming more complex as people
Mhm.
move to more knowledge-based jobs. Now, I'm going to put AI into a different thing because, this will pull us into that direction. Just put aside AI for a minute. But basically, everywhere as economies mature, jobs become more complex, knowledge demands become more complex, and therefore the importance of cognitive ability becomes more salient. Um, if you ask yourself, why does cognitive ability predict? The literature is very clear on that point. It says that it causes people, and this is a causal statement at this point, it causes people to acquire more job knowledge, whatever job that they're doing. And there was a early paper that it got replicated again with a different data set in the last couple of years. Hambrick and Oswald and a couple of other authors, they published in Journal of Applied Psychology. The importance of cognitive ability does not go down even when experience of the individuals that are being studied rises up. So the differences between lower cognitive ability, medium, and higher level of cognitive ability people retain,
Mhm.
even all groups gain similar amounts of experience over time. The lower ability never catches up with experience. Okay.
Okay.
So
Which I think we've also covered that article in the podcast probably 2 years ago as well. Yeah.
so given that, so I'm with you when you make the observation that jobs are becoming more complex. Now, I set aside AI knowingly for a second because with AI, I see something really interesting because a lot of um, knowledge workers, take coders and so on and so forth, are starting to outsource their work to AI. So, what will it do to those jobs? Well, some of those jobs are disappearing, and some of them are coming back. That's a different story. But um, the claim from a lot of AI types from Silicon Valley is their goal is to have artificial general intelligence. It is the ultimate thing to have. Why is it the ultimate thing to have? Because it will make their tool adaptable, regardless of the problem that gets thrown at it, and it will have excellence regardless of the problem that gets thrown to AI, right?
Yeah.
I find it ironic that in the field of IO psychology, as we go down this path of, oh, we should be selecting on things other than cognitive ability, because some people have taken the message from the articles that have been published by Sackett and colleagues by saying we should just completely dump cognitive ability because of adverse impact and focus on other types of predictors. I find it ironic because as we that would mean that we are going to value general intelligence less in people, but more in artificial intelligence. To me, that means the botification of human workers.
Hmm. Well, and it would never be beyond people to be hypocritical either, you know. So, I mean, and frankly, just I think you have to kind of touch this issue with comfort because this was a really charged issue, right? Around we've had debates for 20, 30, 40 years around adverse impact its relationship with cognitive ability. Can you use it for selection? Should you use it for selection? Are there alternatives that are better? Are there certain situations where it's valid and other situations where it's not valid? Are there certain situations where it's legal and other situations where it's not legal? And I mean, this has been a really core issue. And so I get people's motivation to say, hey, if we can throw this thing out, let's just throw it out. Is it even worth the trouble? And is that a reasonable perspective, or is there an alternative perspective we should be considering?
I take a global perspective to all of this. This is a
Hmm.
very US perspective,
Yeah.
right? I've worked with colleagues and I've actually consulted in South Africa when the issue where laws deal with and actually dictate um, quotas for different language groups, for example. Or, I have colleagues that I collaborate with from India, which also deals differently with some of these things. So I think that putting all the pressure of solving adverse impact on IO psychology and only the personnel selection corner of IO psychology misses the big picture of all the levers that are possibly available to us to address some societal concerns, and actually might backfire by reducing U.S. productivity, right? Because can think about it this way, just to take two variable world. If you have just conscientiousness and cognitive ability as your two predictors, and you're trying to predict task performance, forget about overall for a second. Let's say task. If that is the case, then how work gets done is going to differ, right? I mean, even if you're trying to reach a certain level of performance using each predictor, working harder, working smarter, more hours, getting it done quickly, moving on to the next thing. I mean, so there are trade-offs in all of this, right? There are
Mhm.
trade-offs in all of this. So it is I think IO psychology and testing in particular, and cognitive testing in particular, has been the lightning rod for too long. And I think there are other levers that need to be used and other approaches. And this is not IO psychology's problem to solve. This is a societal problem to solve.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. Um, and I wanted to make sure that it's clear that like you're an incredibly prolific researcher yourself, and this isn't like your only feather in your cap. I'm wondering. You mentioned before, and I read some of these articles before the podcast as well, that you're doing more in the individual differences space as well. What's some of the hot work that you're doing in that area right now?
Oh, I have been accumulating a lot of information, a lot of data sets, um, very methodically for the past 20 years, working toward three publications that are now all out. I'm very pleased about that. On the individual differences side of things, of course, you mentioned already the Stanek on Ohms Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences and the book that came associated with it. In the book, and I highly recommend. The book is an interesting thing. You should not read the book from cover to cover. It's best read first read the preface and then get oriented. And there are some really interesting insights into where this came from and what might be a particular good path for you to read that book might be. But it contains a particular theory, cybernetic trait complexes theory, that I think is, I'm not a theory person. I've never been a theory person. I've always looked at my data and said, okay, what is there to explore? What is there to look at here? Is there any discovery to be made here? Right? I mean, I am an inductive person by nature. And um, the theory is something that I resisted for a long time until I could not resist it anymore. And the only way to make sense of the findings, the voluminous findings that we had in Anchors and Sails was the book was by putting forth this theory of cybernetic trait complexes. In essence, what the theory says is people are bundles of traits and bundles of abilities. Each one of us is unique combination of these different things. And those things mean something else in terms of our success, in terms of our failures, in terms of our derailments, and so on. So you ask, what have you been working on that you're excited about? We just published in Psychological Bulletin in the last half year an article on mapping success, life success. This is all based on meta-analytic work that shows that there are different paths to success, different combinations of traits that can be wielded for different types of success. And we have these profiles in that paper, and so that's one of them. The other one, this is something else that I'm really proud of. It just appeared in Journal of Applied Psychology a couple of months ago as a monograph. And the significance of that to me is it puts together these bundles to show what is dysfunctional and what's maladaptive, the counterproductivity space, which traits come together to make people more counterproductive, maladaptive, dysfunctional. And there are different profiles that are associated with that. So none of this single trait, and it relates to this, putting them all in conjunction with one another is something that we published. And I like that. And the piece that is a personal meaningfulness to me is in 1993, when I got my PhD, my first publication in Journal of Applied Psychology was my integrity testing meta-analysis, which was a monograph. That's how I entered the field. In 2026, to get a second monograph on counterproductivity is personally meaningful to me.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, and you mentioned earlier, how it's not good to have a myopic kind of U.S. only view on a lot of these things. And my understanding is you're from Turkey originally, and in an eighth generation college professor and scholar, which is amazing. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure, sure. I moved to the United States in 1986. And I have been a citizen since 1999. And so this past weekend was particularly meaningful to me with the 250th anniversary of our independence in our country. I moved to the United States because I believe in the principles of the United States, the founding principles of the United States. And this is the country that gave me the freedom to say what is on my mind and not be censored and be able to research what I need to research. And I do things because I am grateful to this country for making me their own. In terms of my background, yes, I am an eighth generation college professor and a scholar, going back to 1700s on my mother's side. But this is not an elitist statement because every few generations there was complete collapse. So, being in the Ottoman Empire, um, They were chased away from where they lived. They arrived as refugees in Istanbul. There are people in that lineage. My great grandfather, my grandfather, who was a college professor, wrote a geometry book, several geometry books, and brought actually geometry to Turkish universities in 1930s and 40s. He was an orphan, and grew up in an orphanage. Okay.
Oh wow.
And that's why I will always think of cognitive ability as the thing that is the gateway for people that do not have the lineage, that do not have the support. It is within them that it enables them to reach places and do things. Um, Interestingly enough, we talk about Jack Hunter. Few people
Mhm.
know that he also grew up in an orphanage. And when he received the Lifetime Contributions Award from the American Psychological Association, he stood up there and thanked the systems, the federal and state systems that were in place that enabled him to get an education in that orphanage so that he could go on to make the contributions that he made.
Wow. I didn't know that. That's incredible.
Yeah. It, it,
Oh,
it can it can get heavy fairly quickly, but I think
yeah.
I like seeing the bigger picture, right? Because all of these are can be some of these debates can be thought about as small bickerings and range restriction here. What do we use in the standard deviation there? What kind of specific correction we use? And I try not to lose the big picture of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and if I at the end of the day I can say I helped people, organizations, this country, and humanity reach better decisions based on each individual's strengths and weaknesses, I am a happy person.
Well, that is fantastic. Well, Denise, just this is going to seem like a hard transition, and I apologize, but would you like to join me in Cole's Corner?
Sure.
I'm going to do my
Happy
best.
to, happy to.
Welcome to Cole's Corner. All right. Well, first, let's start out with some rapid fire questions. So, if you were not a college professor, what would you have done with your career?
Oh, I have two answers to that one. I almost went one way, and thankfully I didn't, because I don't think that I would have been as good in that field as I am, think, as an
Hmm.
pseudo psychologist. In high school, everybody thought that I was going to be musical actress because I have been in, for example, in Evita, playing Evita herself, right? So I've done that, and theater has really taught me a lot of good organizational skills. So that's one, but I don't think that would have been a very successful career, given that there are so many really, really talented people. What I would probably end up doing is I would be a great event organizer, because I actually relish in it. And when I retire, I have these visions that I might be a museum curator.
That's awesome. Love that. What's the place you've never been to that you'd most like to go and why?
Oh, there are going to be three of them. And I've got to get to these places in the next decade. I've got to somehow make it happen. One, Peru, particularly Machu Picchu.
Hmm. That's a good one.
Two, Japan.
Hmm.
I've never been. And number three, the entire Silk Road.
Oh, interesting.
So,
I've never gotten that one before. That's a good answer.
well, I like connecting ideas, places, and I like old and new and thriving and fusion of foods,
Hmm.
cultures, peoples, where, everything is so manifest.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I love that. Um, if you were a character in any book, TV show, or movie, who would you be and why?
Um, the great late Maggie Smith played a couple of characters, and I think the overlap between them is who I would be. One of them was Minerva McGonagall, in and then the other one is the Dowager Countess Grantham in Downton Abbey, where there are these. Both of them are characters where tradition and past knowledge matters, and you have to guard it. But then also you have to have the soft spot and the openness to know when you've got to turn forward and move forward and help people. That are currently around you. So I think that soft spot with the discipline and the and the rigor is sort of what I get drawn to.
All right, I've got one big question for you, and I'm actually really, really curious your answer to this because I've been waiting for this for the podcast is and because I find that most professors actually have a really good view on this type of question, which is what is one thing that the field of biopsychology is getting horribly wrong?
We are at a cusp, and people are not realizing or looking at the big picture as much as they should. Um, I try to, in my own work with, for example, environmental sustainability and employee green behaviors and so on. I have a whole stream about that also. So
Yep.
this big picture is sometimes lacking, and in particular with AI. Um, as we involve more and more machine learning, natural language processing, AI, take your variant thereof, in what we do, I think people are not realizing how much more industrialized that this is going to become, because everything will all of a sudden scale up so fast, and so it'll influence so many more people than what a test publisher or a consulting company can do, that I really, really worry about it, that we will outsource our decision making to AI about people, and that is a concern of mine.
Absolutely. I love that. Well, let's move into what am I reading really quickly. So this is actually a paper. I am just so lucky because what I get to do is I get to publish little things out there and then get to bring really smart people on who are smarter than me to actually talk about them. And so my colleague Tyler Weeks, who's a prior guest on the podcast, and we had this dinner at a conference, and over some cocktails we had been talking a lot on the podcast. The theme of this year has really been like the work on the power law and how that's related to performance, job performance on the job, and what are the implications that might mean for pre-hire assessments. And so Tyler, being the physicist that he is, he was just very curious about using something like Monte Carlo simulation to determine your best hire might fail your assessment. And what mean field theory inspired us to ask about the limits of talent selection. So essentially, what we found in this kind of baseline research is that if you bucket candidates into kind of average levels of performance in a Monte Carlo simulation, you would actually find that yes, a higher score on an assessment would lead to higher levels of job performance. But when you get into that Pareto distribution, that there actually you might find that your best of the best candidates might be deselected from the process. And so I was just curious, and let me find the end of the article because I think it states it best. What this means for practice is that the vast majority of hiring decisions, assessments improve outcomes. However, specifically focusing on identifying extreme performers, these high influence roles, according to the power law, might not be as likely to be selected in this case. And so I wanted to get your perspective on this as somebody who's done a lot of work in the selection realm. Have you had this concern? And let me actually, I'll get to it in a second because I have one big kind of thought that I'd love to get your perspective on in this space. But what did you think about this article?
Well, actually, that was, I thought it was a very thoughtful article. And I think, you spelled it out in a very interesting way. You simulated your
Mhm.
data in an interesting way as well. I think your concern is one that I've heard from other people as well.
Mhm.
And it goes back to what we talked about before, right? It goes back to for what, right? I mean, so basically, what is the criterion? In your article, you talk about job performance,
Mhm.
um, but I'm not sure that the power law is for job performance. It's been maybe for extraordinary accomplishments, right? It is for,
This is one of the key
breakthroughs.
debates. It's like, what
Yeah,
is it for?
exactly. So basically, are you trying to optimize key breakthroughs and innovation and creativity and things like that? Or are you trying to optimize for overall job performance, which includes avoiding negative behaviors such as sexual harassment, such as stealing from the company,
Yeah.
such as showing up for work, and so on and so forth? Does it include citizenship behavior? So that key piece, I think, is really important. I know that your simulation was just assuming overall job
Yeah.
performance. But if you're going to apply it in the real world, you really need a good answer to that question before you say, "Oh, some of my top performance will be missing." The other thing is if the assumption might be, and I think it was a minus 0.15 or something like that you assumed in the simulation, if I
Mhm.
recall that. It's been a while since I've read your paper.
Yeah.
Um, um, if the predictor criterion relation is minus 15 among top performers, um, I try to think about what is this predictor? Is there such a predictor? And the closest that I can come up with is um, conscientiousness for predicting innovation, and that relation is minus oh 0.05. I've not seen any predictor that turns that severely negative at the top end.
Mhm.
So for a very particular criterion, there you might end up, again, I didn't, take the time to simulate my own data to see
Yeah.
what would happen if I did the 0.05 rather than the minus 0.15. But so there might be cases, but for 99.5% of the cases, that is not going to happen, is sort of my thinking on it.
Yeah.
But I think it's a question that is worth asking whenever a company is trying to figure out what are we maximizing for and why and for whom. The other point that it brought for me, reading your article brought forward for me, is um, our typical off-the-shelf measures are made for people to distinguish among people in the middle of the range.
Yes. You're getting at the core piece of this. Yes.
Yeah. And but there are measures. If you know that your applicant pool or the people that you should be considering for a particular position are in an upper bucket, there are
Hmm.
measures that can be customized for that upper bucket. I worked many moons ago on major Fortune 500 companies computer adaptive test, a cognitive ability test, because they wanted to give the test for everywhere as the first step, anywhere from custodians that were applying for the company to
Hmm.
the CEO, potential CEO, right?
Yeah.
And so we did a computer adaptive measure. So within 10 or 12 questions, you could very easily keep moving the difficulty of the cognitive assessment to the higher end, so that you are actually measuring the person accurately at that upper tail.
You're going to get as close to the theta as possible. I
You
love
got
it.
it. You got it.
Yeah, I still know things. No, I think one of the things that's super interesting about this is it kind of goes back to what you're saying about NBA players and height. It's once you've pre-selected for the height, which would be this assessment that's just geared at normal within the like one or two standard deviations of the mean. That's where height is going to play a big role into your basketball performance. But once you've restricted the range to just some of the tallest people on earth, now we need to be selecting for something different. And if you know your hyper, power law enabled performers that are a very small subset of your population, but have a huge impact on your organization really matter, you need to be engaging in some kind of range restricted, just focused on those hyper performers and not just selecting for the average.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
my second question for you, and this is not in the article, but it's just something that's been bugging me. Why can't we get better than just like I always use the rule. I know there are some measures that are slightly better than this, but just a 0.2 correlation. Why have we never gotten really much better than 0.2 in terms of selecting for job performance?
Um, wait, performance is multiply determined, right? So
Mm-hmm.
basically, when you look at job performance, it is determined by declarative knowledge, procedural knowledge, and
Mm-hmm.
motivation. And then a whole lot of things go into those three buckets, right? So, what produces the job knowledge and procedural knowledge? Well, people's cognitive abilities do. Not just general mental ability, but a particularly specific ability. If you're going to do a mechanical ability based performance in your job, that's going to probably play a role as well. Um, as well as how persistently you put your effort toward acquiring that knowledge. So you can, for each of the paths, there'll be personality predictors, interest predictors that come into play. What we're doing is we typically have access to people's individual differences. Otherwise, we are too narrow. Um, can we get better prediction at the toward predicting that criterion of past performance or overall performance, even through those paths? Yes, if you more directly measure job knowledge and procedural knowledge, you're likely to get a better because it's closer, more proximal in
Mm-hmm.
terms of as an antecedent in producing that criterion. But um, what that would lock you into is the concept of a job. And I'm not sure that the concept of a job, the way that we understand it, will persist much more into the future. Now
Mm.
that's a weird thing to say, but I usually see 10, 20, 30 years down the road, not just next year. But I am thinking that when people get hired, yes, they're getting hired to do a job, but a lot of people do craft their jobs
Mm-hmm.
eventually. How many people stay exactly in the same job in the same company once they're hired? Most people move up or side or someplace, right? Or out, right? So ultimately, I do not think that job is perhaps what we should be selecting for. Yes, that should be an element for of what should be we should be selecting for, but maybe careers with our company, careers while people are with us is what we should be selecting for. So an entire talent management system, a lot of times, be it cognitive ability assessments, be it personality assessments, they get, looked at the beginning in selection and then they're locked away. Well, I submit that those assessments must be repeated and must be taken into account as people's careers unfold. And what needs to be maximized is throughout their career with your organization, what is likely to produce the biggest output, biggest performance for the organization, as well as well being for the individual. We should not overlook well being as an important criterion that we should worry about for people's dignity in organizations.
Absolutely. Let me hit you with the next one really quickly. We don't have to spend a ton of time on this one. I just thought it was interesting. It was called Publish or Perish: Hyper Competitive Culture, Performance, and Well-Being in Academia. And so every time I bring on an academic, I always make sure to cover something about what it takes to do academic publishing, because I just find it to be the currency of the land and therefore fascinating for you guys as a population. And so what this article found is that, do academic researchers perform better in more aggressive, masculine, hyper competitive cultures? And the answer is no. In such environments, they have lower publication rates, lower citation impact, lower employee well being, and higher turnover intentions. There's more to cover here, but I just wanted to get, what was your reaction to this one, and how does that track with your own personal experience in academic publishing?
Uh, I My personal experience probably is not typical, but I'll share it anyway. But perhaps it's a healthier approach. Maybe it helps somebody out there. I have never worried about where I'm publishing and when I am publishing, with whom I'm publishing. I just want the ideas to get out there. And I
Hmm.
undertake research and publications. Publications to me are an afterthought. I do work and I research because I am genuinely interested in a topic and knowing the answer to a question, and trying to be helpful to people or trying to help organizations in some shape or form. And I then think about, okay, sure, this should be written up and I should publish this, but that is never my, oh, I have to publish, therefore, I never thought about publishing is a side effect for me. Is sort of it's a side product of what I love doing. And sometimes it's difficult because publishing is a lot of sweat, a lot of persistence, having a very thick skin, and not never giving up. And it's sort of a measure of resilience, if you will.
Hmm.
And I do that because I think the idea is worth getting out there so that people other than me know what I have found out. So that's how I come to it.
Yeah, no, I
And
love it.
if that gives me tenure and gets me, professorships and so on and so forth, that's great. But I have reached a point in my career that there are some ideas and some important things that I am even willing to put out there without my name on it, just so that the ideas are out there.
I actually have a question. Um, why would you? Well, how do I phrase this? Why would your name not
Bluntly,
be on it? Why would your name not be on it?
um, if it means that it'll, some people are allergic to others. There
Mhm.
is there is fractionation among scholars in our field, unfortunately. And if somebody seeing my name is going to treat the idea as lesser than it is because they think that anything that comes from Denise Ohms is not worthy of their eyeballs, then I'd rather publish it without my name on it, because if I believe in the idea.
Thank you so much for saying that. Um, One of the things that has fascinated me is the what I call the political economy of publishing.
Mhm.
And a lot of people think of concepts like peer review and just the concept of science itself as kind of above reproach, and human, motivations don't really get into it. And the thing that's so interesting to me is everybody that I know in academia absolutely understands to its core the political economy of how to get published, publishing cartels, the whole, replication crisis and everything. I actually even fell for April Fool's joke this year that came up because somebody had published, an IO psychologist researcher had published that lo and behold, new research comes out and the replication crisis is over. And I had taken the article and was prepping it for the podcast when somebody told me, Cole, that's an April Fool's joke, right? And I was so bummed out by it. But the reality is that just like any other human process, the scientific process is fallible,
Absolutely.
and as a consequence we have to be to understand this. And that's why I actually brought up this article that some people would say that it's that hyper competitiveness that leads to certain people publishing and other people not, or maybe it's resilience like you mentioned earlier. But I would say there's actually a third variable, which is just the political economy of it, which is some people are able to publish because they have the right connections or the right idea, the quote unquote right ideas, and other people don't and therefore aren't able to. And that in itself is a corruption of the scientific process and things that, are just unsavory. And so I actually appreciate that you shared that a second ago.
Yeah, I've served as editor of International Journal of Selection and Assessment many moons ago, and I've been associate editor at several journals. Currently, I'm an associate editor at a personality journal, believe it or not, as well as I'm on the boards of 9 different journals right now, and
Hmm.
I see it all the time. Some reviewers are motivated. I mean, there's no other way of putting it, right? And a good editor sees through that. And some editors are motivated themselves, not others. I mean, but it's a very human thing. I mean, it was true even hundreds of years ago with scientists being censored and so on. And sometimes that's how it functions these days as well. But in I also have to give credit where credit is due. There are many really excellent editors who actually try to correct those biases as they're occurring, and sort of tilt the process so that it comes to what it's supposed to be. So you're lucky if you end up with one of those editors, and if your reviewers are also open minded people who
Hmm.
are not just wielding their own frameworks and their own theories and saying this is the way it's supposed to be.
Or you can just do what I do and I smuggle all my ideas out there on Substack. And then there's just, you can say whatever you want.
Yeah. Eventually, I think that all of publishing as an enterprise, peer-reviewed publishing, as we know it today, will
Mhm.
collapse. I mean, basically, we will have running commentaries on all articles, and everything will sort of be freely available. Of course, this is not in the interest of all publishers
Mhm.
and so on, but eventually, I think the whole system will collapse. I
Yeah.
don't know how long it'll take, maybe 100 years, who knows?
Or five. We'll see. Um, I'm very much in agreement about that, by the way. Let me hit you with the last one really quick. I know we're kind of over on time, but recent article came out last year from Michael Campion, previous guest of the podcast, friend of the podcast, and it is called "Can Legal and Professional Personnel Selection Principles Be Met with Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence?" Um, and I mean, I think the actual title of it says it pretty well, because what he does an excellent job of in the tables in this article is he just goes through the current scientific evidence on machine learning and how all the different steps that you would go through in terms of personnel selection, like scoring employment applications, scoring answers to assessment questions, scoring answers to video interviews, not increasing diversity and subgroup differences, measuring personality traits, measuring job requirements. It goes through all the different research that shows the relationship between machine learning techniques that currently exist out there and the ability to do personnel selection. However, ensuring like where are the shortcomings as well. And so I wanted to get your perspective on this, knowing kind of what you said earlier about how AI is sort of changing everything before our eyes and how we need to take a broader lens on how the work that we does matters. How did you react to this article and just the concept more broadly?
I've seen, I had read that article previous to you sharing that, as well as um, I have seen other book chapters, and even at SciUp, I've been to sessions where that idea was discussed. We had also a session on validity and what it means to have validity with machine learning and what we need to look
Mhm.
at, and so on and so forth, that I was part of at this last SciUp. And I think everybody's asking the right questions. I appreciate the questions that are being asked, but the problem is this is all a moving target. Before we can answer something, we now have a new model, and with AI or with somebody else's system, that I think this is moving so fast that we are falling behind as a field, and I don't have a remedy for that. I really don't. The best thing I can say is I put a lot of faith in practitioners. Yes, we are all scientist practitioners, and everybody likes repeating that, and I like repeating that too. But I put probably more faith in practitioners than a lot of my colleagues do as scholars,
Yeah, you're
because
pretty rare.
the reason is I think we are a field that always follows practice. People tend to think about, oh yeah, practice should follow science. But I think as a field, we have always been a field that follows practice. Practitioners on the ground come up with systems, approaches, answers to particular questions, and then scientists come and say, okay, let us study what you have been doing. Let's put together all of these other things and things that you think you're seeing, and maybe course correct you a little bit. But I think that has been the story of IO psychology throughout the last 100+ years. I mean, think about the days of World War I, when nobody knew, you should be selecting people using a cognitive ability test. We won World War I partially based on correct allocation of human resources to jobs in the armed forces. Same thing true in Second World War. I mean, so people on the ground have invented and are innovative, and that's where the rubber meets the road. And I think academics need to pay a lot more attention to what is going on with practitioners and collaborate with them, because frankly, innovation will come from practice.
I think that's such a good kind of mic drop way to end this thing. So, Denise, thank you so much for being a guest. This has been a fantastic episode. If people want to reach out to you and learn more, where can they find you?
Well, my email is at the University of Minnesota. They can reach out to me. My book with Kevin Stanek of Anchors and Sails. It is eye-opening in some senses of the word. Don't think about it just as a scholarly book. And there is for anybody who doesn't want to read the full treatment, Kevin and I have a primer as well as a really cool visualization where they can explore. And then, of course, they can go to my Google Scholar page to see my more recent publications that I mentioned.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for hanging with me and finally getting you on here. So, but you've been listening to Directionally Correct, People Intelligence podcast with your host, Cole Napper, and today's guest, Denise Onez. Thanks for joining me, Denise.
Thank you for having me.